Well, cool. Well, why don't we get started? I want to welcome everybody who's joining us live today on today's program, A Leadership Journey. This is a part one of a three-part series. Obviously, all of you can watch this. Anybody can watch this again on the recording on our YouTube channel, so please do subscribe. Brought to you by Taking Point Leadership. Learn more about our organization at the website takingpointleadership.com. Also sponsored by our new e-learning platform. You can find more about our Change Leadership Certification course at takingpointacademy.com. So why don't we dive in? What we're going to do today really is unpack all that knowledge, wisdom, experience from your brain over the next YouTube live podcast here, Matthew. So
good luck.
Again, for a lot of you on, or some of you who will watch, I've had the experience and honor of being able to know you, work with you for over 22 years. You put me through SEAL training, or same team deployed together. But for part one, we really want to take it all the way back, because as we know, leadership is a lifelong journey, and most leaders are impacted to some degree about their upbringing, their family life, where they grew up, how they grew up, their educational background, these different experiences that they have, the good, bad, and the ugly, and how that has a long-term impact on our ability to lead others, engage others, create a clear vision, emotional discipline, all these different things that our life brings forth when we're in front of others and we're meant to lead and engage teams on a common goal. So kind of wanted to start with some backstory on who you are, where you grew up, and what life was like in the early days of Mathew Lehnig.
All right, so I was born in La Mesa, California, and I grew up in Imperial Beach, which is the most southern beach town in the United States of America. It's also where the Silver Strand Training Complex is located.
Yep.
As a matter of fact, my grandfather's home, pretty much borderlines the south side of the fence to that training complex. And I kind of grew up around the surrounding area, maybe 2 blocks over, from that. So, it was, I grew around the military, grew up in a very patriotic place where the military was deeply loved. So that was great. As far as how I grew up, I grew up extremely poor, didn't have a lot of money. But through that, I learned a lot of great life lessons, a lot about humility, empathy for others. You are what you make yourself. I never really let the fact that I grew up poor deter me from anything. I figured out how to persevere through that, and, during that time, I developed a lot of self-awareness. I gained a keen eye for my surroundings. And as I said earlier, before we hopped on, I had extremely high intelligence when it came to self-preservation, because Imperial Beach was definitely a very rough town to grow up in.
Yeah.
We had a lot of gangs, biker gangs. We had a lot of, we were right on the border of Mexico, so there was quite a few, gangs as well coming from San Isidro and even from, Mexico City. So it was definitely, it was pretty tough. But I had a lot of street smarts when I grew up. I learned how to hustle, at a very young age. I learned the gift of gab, so to speak. I could talk my way into and pretty much out of anything. So that kind of helped me a lot throughout life. And I think the lessons learned throughout my childhood, and my early adulthood really prepared me, and set me up for future success. To be honest with you.
Sometimes when folks grow up in environments like that, the struggle to survive, the struggle to fit in, did you get kind of ever get sucked down that wrong path? Is that did that ever occur to you? Were you able to kind of stay out of the muck, or a little bit of both?
No, I think I was pretty fortunate. I had a really good, solid group of friends. We all kind of lived in a very close proximity. And don't get me wrong. I mean, we definitely, had a lot of, good times and bad times, but we were always there for one another. We spent a lot of our time outside, so we gained a lot of, knowledge through that. And, Imperial Beach is one of those areas where, you can stay there your entire life, or, you can get out. So it definitely had, there was definitely some influences there that could have, but, I just didn't see myself as that individual. I wanted to do more.
Right. What would you say, looking back in your years leading up to joining the Navy, what were some of your early influences in leadership? Who did you admire? Who did you aspire to be? If maybe you didn't even realize it at the time, but upon reflection, who would you say were some of your earliest leadership influences?
So I guess, my primary source of leadership in my early years was my older brother. And then I would say my early adult years, it was my grandfather. And then once he passed away, it was my Uncle Patrick. So my brother, man, he was smart as a whip. Even though he was only a year and a half older than I was, he taught me so many life lessons. He really shaped the way I looked at myself. He showed me that anything was possible. He was one that really taught me to be super independent. As a matter of fact, it was really funny because about 3 years ago, we were on the phone and I was having a very long discussion with him about this, and it completely, blew his mind. He was like, really, are you serious? Because the reality is we really grew up together depending on one another because, if I go back a little bit, my mom, she was a single mother, and I saw my father periodically on the weekends, so, I have a brother, I have two stepsisters and a stepbrother as well. I have a couple foster families that I really leaned on growing up, the Gallegos and the Batums, which we're still in touch today. My mom worked long hours. She worked from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. She worked for NCIS in the military. So we grew up outside a lot. We spent a lot of our time outside exploring, seeing how far we could push ourselves. We were always in the ER, but through that, and
With your
growing up
mom
that way,
or because you were injured?
just because we were injured all the time. I mean, we were really pushing ourselves. I mean, with biking and so on and so forth thing. I mean, we were, consistently getting hurt. I mean, I can't even tell me how many bones I broke or, but, through that, I built a lot of self-confidence, a lot of self-esteem, a lot of perseverance, commitment, and discipline, and that was really, my brother, really kind of pushing those values on me. As a matter of fact, between him and my friends, a great story is we heard about this, skateboard ramp that was about 50 miles away. And so I was 10 years old at the time. And my brother, who was 11 and a half, and a few other friends, we decided that we were going to take a trip and go to this thing, so we planned it out.
What size, I'm assuming we're talking a half pipe. What size ramp are we talking?
Yeah, we're talking about a half pipe. We're
12
talking
foot?
probably. Oh yeah, it was one of the bigger ones that was made back in the day. So, but I mean, we drove our bikes 3 miles to the trolley station. Rode that another, God knows how many, down into the Bonita stop. We took 5 different buses. We got off the bus. We rode another 5 miles down into this massive canyon. So I mean, that just kind of tells you, at 10 years old, to be able to do that. It was just a lot of that leadership and disability. And then I would say, after 10, I would say it was my grandfather. He became an incredible mentor, and he taught me a lot about accountability, commitment, and consistency. And I guess, his motto was, your word is your bond. He was a retired Navy commander. He was in World War II. He was a part of the specialized group called the On the Roof Gang, which were a bunch of Navy cryptologists and radio men. He was basically pioneered the crypto field, and had a lot of the early victories in World War II. And then he was really big on, building the entire training structure. And then he moved it to Pensacola. And what was interesting about that is, growing up, I didn't know a lot about that in his life. It wasn't until I was actually in the military, and I was in A school at the time, and I get a phone call and they said, hey, you need to have your whites ready. So I was like, okay. My grandmother and my uncle Dwayne Whitlock, who retired a captain, picked me up. Mm-hmm. And then in that 30-minute drive, they explained to me everything that my grandfather had done in the military. And I was completely blown away. And they ended up, they were basically, naming a building 3744 after him, which was named Carmichael Hall. So pretty, super impressive on what he did and what he was able to do. But, and then I would say later on in life, it was really my Uncle Patrick. He became, my greatest mentor. He was very well spoken. He was super business savvy. very successful. He had a high pedigree in his field of expertise. He set me on a path that would truly define me as a man, and not only that, but he was also an incredible father figure, a mentor, and an advisor, throughout my life. And, he continues to be to this day.
Yeah. What led you to join the Navy? And was it the Navy in general? Did you always have aspirations to be a Naval Special Warfare as a SEAL operator? What led you to that one of the most impactful decisions of your life?
So there was a couple. First, it was quite interesting. So my mother worked for NCIS. So this is a funny story. But because she worked for NCIS,
I find that extremely ironic, by the way.
Yeah, she got to know a lot of team guys, right? Because they were always getting in trouble back then. But anyway, she always, they were great people. They made some bad decisions at the time, but she always made this comment like, you would be an incredible SEAL, and I always thought that was interesting. My grandfather really, he was a little bit, because he was in the military, so I always thought about the Navy. But then I had really two mentors. One was a guy by the name of Larry Jung, and another one was Dave Jefferson. So Larry, was my next door neighbor for many years. He's retired. He retired at W4 out of the center. Phenomenal man, great mentor. And Dave was a senior chief, in the military. And, they were really kind of influential and always saying, hey, I think you'd be a great team guy, this, that, and the other thing. But I never, at the time, I was always like, yeah, sure, that sounds great. But, I had other aspirations at the time.
Right.
And then I was working at the health food store down in Imperial Beach. And I had several, SEALs, not only cadre, but team guys, but also, gentlemen that were going through buds. And so, they would come in a lot, and I'd see the guys just coming out of Hell Week, and I'm like, man, that looks amazing. I want to do that. Right.
You thought that looked amazing.
Right. And so two funny stories is, I never told both of these guys, Larry or Dave, that I decided to join the Navy and go in the SEAL teams. And so as I was going through the program, Dave was an instructor in third phase, and he wasn't there the first, 4 weeks of training. And so when we were heading out to the island, he shows up and asked somebody to carry his surfboard. So of course I volunteered, but he didn't look at me. And so now we're on the airplane flying out, and he looks at me and he sits down right in front of me. And all of a sudden, you see his head go like, what the? And then he turns around and he looks at me and he's like, what in the heck are you doing here? So I would say the next 3 days on the island were horrific. I had to prove to him that I was a team guy. And then the other story is, now I'm on my first deployment overseas, and, Larry at the time was the training officer out in Guam. And so I'm coming through the quarterdeck and I see him and I'm like, hey, Larry, how you doing? And he goes, hey, Matt, what the? And so, so both of these guys who are my mentors and, told me that I would be a great SEAL, eventually, I walked past them, and neither of them knew that I was even in. So it was quite funny. But really the reality is, all four of them, plus, all the people that I saw over time and growing up in a military town, I mean, it was inevitable, to be honest with you.
How old were you when you entered the Navy, went to boot camp, and by the time you got to buds?
So I was a little bit older. I joined the military when I was 22 or 20, when I was 21. But then I was on the delayed entry program for a little bit, so I went in when I was 21, and I went boot camp. I took the test there, went to A school, took the test there, and then went straight to basic underwater demolition school, class 191. Yep. And, went straight through the program in 6 months. So
191, that was back in the early 80s, right?
Yeah, January 1994.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Sorry.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
Yeah, no, but I mean, that's about the same for me. I went in, I think I was just turned 23, boot camp, A school. I picked the shortest A school that was in San Diego to get to buds as quickly as possible, and it ended up working out. But let's, bringing it back to leadership, obviously just by the nature of how you increase in rank and gradually become a leader of people in the military in general, but obviously also in Naval Special Warfare. Describe your early days as a leader. What held you back? Where do you think your shortcomings were, and where did you thrive?
So, I would say it was quite interesting. I would say some of the, the bigger influences, kind of on my leadership style in my early years was really, my grandfather. He passed away prior to me joining the military, but he never really saw me join the military, which is something that has been pretty tough for me because he was such a huge influence. But his
Sure.
foundational leadership principles that he taught me growing up were really the cornerstone of my leadership success. I have a good friend out here who I talk to several, and he continuously make comments. He's like, you were very meticulous, but you were also very, very charismatic, right? He's like, I remember, you were very talkative, because I'm an extrovert, but he's like, the way that you were to get into your gear, the way that you did things, the way that you projected yourself, the way that, you really wanted to engage with individuals, how you were consistently, wanted to absorb, but not also want to absorb information, but also wanted to pass that information on. Right. And so,
Yeah.
I think that was very important. And I learned a lot of that, from my grandfather. He was a man of few words, but what he said was to the point, and that's kind of how I led, how I was. I was very to the point, I was very factually based when we talked about leadership development, right? And I also took it from a perspective of I learned a lot, from my grandfather by watching, right? And so
Mhm.
also, I think that is very important, right? How you project yourself, because as a leader, people are always watching, right? And so, being very meticulous, doing the things that I said, especially as you move up and the leadership realm, people are always watching you, right? And they're always looking for the chink in the armor. So you have to be very particular in the way that you present yourself and the way that you do that. And so those fundamental leadership principles, with accountability and all of those things were huge, And then also, my Uncle Patrick was really he was really the foundational rock for me. We had a lot of discussions throughout life. His guidance, his insight, his expertise really also influenced my leadership acumen, early on in my career and, even during and after my military. So, I think when we talk about, you know, making mistakes, or maybe things like that, I think, all the mistakes I made needed to be made, right? All of the
Mhm.
failures that I had
Yeah.
needed to happen in order for me to be who I am now as a leader, right? And so,
What would you say? What would you say, just from a storytelling perspective? What's one of those mistakes? And all leaders make mistakes. It's just a part of that journey, and a lot of them, like you said, do need to be made. It's part of the development and how you mature as a leader. But what's one, if you look back, that you think about more than others?
so I think for me, it was more of my leadership outside of the military, right?
Okay.
So, and what I mean by that is, I find this is such an interesting question. So, to be honest, I think I was right where I needed to be in my leadership journey, and I say that because those experiences that I did happen were going to happen, that happened, and that were going to happen, shaped me to the leader that I am now, right? So, my
Yeah.
advice, for that, well, like I wouldn't change that, right? And I also think the mistakes and the failures that I made growing up were essential for me to grow and develop as a person, right? So each mistake, each failure helped me overcome things, challenges, roadblocks, all that. I became more resilient, adaptable, and through all those things, But again, I'm fallible as a human being, right? As we all are. And so I think when we talk about the job as a Navy SEAL, I was right where I needed to be, right, for the time that needed to happen. But outside of that, off hours, I was definitely not the best role model, to be honest with you,
Okay.
right? So
Interesting.
I was super aggressive. I wasn't, I was drinking a lot, so there was a lot of that. So, I kind of led, some of the younger generation into that a little bit. And so, but again, I learned from that and then, changed my perspective. Obviously, my faith was a big part of that. stop drinking, and then people saw that aspect and that changed a lot of things. Right. And so,
Right.
so I think that was a big learning experience for me, and so through the years, I've had conversations with people about that, and we've discussed that and things like that. So I think that's really more so is outside of the leadership realm and more so inside, because I think when you're training people to go to war, there's a certain mindset you have to have, and there's a certain framing in the way that you do things that is super important, and I think that helped a lot of people, as they moved on and off the battlefield.
It's really interesting that you said that, and I noticed that in my early days as a new guy, and
Mm-hmm.
you're kind of mouth shut. You're observing everybody, like you said. Anybody in leadership position, all the eyeballs are on you. So, as a newer person in the teams, looking to people like you, or to my LPO, or to my chief, or just the general the E5s in my first platoon, you're always absorbing, who you feel is doing it right, who's doing it wrong, what are they doing on the battlefield, so to speak, and how do they behave off the battlefield.
Mm-hmm.
You see this in all organizations where a lot of leaders will play the role, they play the act, that they are perceived as a good leader on the job, but they have quite a different personal life outside of the job. And so that, and they think that people don't notice that, but especially in a culture like, and I know this culture has transformed a lot intentionally, but of the old school work hard, play hard culture,
Mm-hmm.
Naval Special Warfare, we've done a pretty significant job of shifting that culture of leaders and resetting those expectations of what we expect of all leaders and all team members, on the job, but also sometimes even more so off the job. We're looking for a different level of character, different level of maturity, values orientation. So I love that you told that story, because you see this in so many organizations where, the leader is pushing values around integrity and all these different things, yet they're cheating on their wife or they're making faulty business decisions and deals that really aren't good for the organization or that stretch outside the core values of the organization. So it's an interesting topic, because that's one that doesn't seem to get talked about a lot, is what the well-rounded individual looks like in all aspects of their lives. Because there's an intimate.
I also think too that it was really, back then it was also a part of the culture, right? And I think we've also had a huge, massive cultural shift, especially after the war. The cultural shift from that type of mentality had changed severely, and I think that was a benefit to the organization. Don't get me wrong. I mean, you can still blow off steam. It was just kind of how we did that. So, I personified, that type of, character on and off work hours. Right. And so, it's interesting because if you talk to individuals from back then, you're like, oh yeah, that was exactly what, we all thought that would be, and so, but as you mature and you become more senior, you realize, no, there's a better way to do things. Right. And so I think that's super important. But one thing I will say, is failures and mistakes are going to happen. Right. But as a person, you're defined by what you do next. Right. And I think that's super important to understand. Right. Because we're all fallible, like I said earlier, but we all have to continue to get up and move the needle forward, for sure.
100%. So last question that I want to kind of dig into here is knowing what you know now. Obviously, you've evolved a lot as a human, like we all do over the years, as we mature and grow and get married and have children and different expectations in our lives and different different roles and responsibilities. What would you, if you had one piece of advice to give, let's say like you in your late 20s, maybe you're an LPO, maybe you're coming up on chief or something like that, you as an early leader in the SEAL teams, what would the you today tell that leader now, if you had one piece of advice to give to avoid any pitfalls?
Well, that's a very hard one to answer. And why I say that is because in your leadership journey, all of those things that you do, good or bad, are really what define you as a leader and continually help you grow in your leadership acumen. So I guess for me, it's very difficult. I don't think that I would tell myself to change a thing, because, I look at back then and who I was and where I am now. And if all of those things hadn't happened, it wouldn't have brought me to where I was now before I retired out of such an incredible organization. So those failures and, those moments of where I made mistakes and all of those things, they helped me grow. They helped me develop into the person that I am. They helped me, be, like I said earlier, they helped me become more resilient, more adaptable. And so when difficult things happened, that came in front of me, I looked at it from a perspective of like, okay, I made the mistake. I'm going to hold myself accountable. I'm not going to make that mistake again. And hopefully people that see this happen, they'll learn from that, right? Because again, as a leader, all eyes are on you, right? So even when you do get in trouble and you make mistakes, they're going to look at you and see how you react. And at the times I reacted the way that I should have reacted and the way that people expected, and again, that's just, my personality, right? So I always took accountability for everything, right?
Well, I
And so
think
for
too
me,
that
super important.
100%. It all comes back to ownership and accountability. And that's exactly what I was going to say. I think that, great leaders are looked to and expected, to sometimes fall short. But again, it's about how they address those mistakes, how they address that shortcoming, especially if they do exhibit extreme ownership. They're going to take much of the burden of the team's shortcomings and failures, on their shoulders. So it's really about the type of character they project and how they exhibit that level of accountability. But again, I was, reflecting after a call with one of the senior leaders at one of our client partner organizations yesterday, and it's a common known thing, but sometimes we have to look back at it and say, like most wisdom in our lives, especially leadership wisdom, it doesn't come from all the good times. It comes from doing the hard things and navigating failure, navigating, arduous circumstances and having to make tough decisions and reflection and course correction. That's where the wisdom comes from. You don't see a lot of really well-respected quote unquote leaders out there who've never experienced adversity. It's not a thing. So I love what you said about the fact that, and maybe that's kind of how you would frame it to yourself, is that, you're going to make mistakes, you're going to screw up, you're going to fall short, but it's going to be what you do in those circumstances that will define you to others as a leader.
Absolutely.
Well, Mathew, this has been a phenomenal session one for this 3-part series, because we really want to get to know you more as a person. What we're going to do in part 2 really is start getting into your leadership journey as a SEAL, 30 years in Naval Special Warfare, and really a lot of the attributes that you developed and evolved over time as you matured as a leader, how that impacted others, and how you've carried that with you throughout your career. We want to thank everybody who was on today live. Obviously, hope you enjoy this conversation. If you watch it on our YouTube channel, please do go subscribe. Again, check out more about us at takingpointleadership.com. And if you're interested in more learning, especially our e-learning platform, please do go take a look at takingpointacademy.com for our Change Leadership Certification course. It's awesome. You will learn a lot. Take it with your team. But until then, we will be in touch about our next program. Have a great day.